Hi, today I'm thrilled to have Adam Walker on the show. He's a seasoned consultant, technologist, and thought leader with nearly 30 years of experience in the pharmaceutical and clinical research space. Adam's expertise spans biometrics, quality assurance, and medtech, with a strong passion for advancing e-health and supporting real-world data and evidence, particularly in rare disease. Throughout his career, Adam has held several global leadership roles, including his most recent work with AstraZeneca, where he managed reporting activities and vendor relationship for real-world evidence and observational studies, specializing in vaccines and immune therapies. From pioneering the implementation of Oracle Clinical at Europe's largest phase 1 and 2 CRO to building in-house data management and statistical teams, Adam's impact has been both technical and strategic. Whether it's managing audits, driving technology adoption, or leading global teams, Adam's approach is professional, solution driven, and deeply focused on quality and collaboration. Today's episode takes a slightly different turn. Yes, we'll dive into data, tech, and drugs, as always, but we'll also explore the challenging job market in pharma and biotech throughout 2024, marked by widespread layoffs. We'll discuss the critical role of personal branding and resilience in navigating career challenges and share practical strategies to prepare for tough economic times and their ripple effect. Please join me in welcoming Adam to the podcast. So, Adam, it's great to have you here.
Thank you very much, Thibaut. It's a pleasure to be here.
As a kind of icebreaker, if you could tell us about yourself, your journey that led you to life science and what you're doing today. Were you into science as a kid?
It's a great place to start. If you were going to ask my parents whether I loved science, the answer would be a resounding yes. Behind my bedroom door, when I was 12 or 13, I had a skeleton, one of these big cardboard skeletons in 3D. And I always had a passion for medicine, and at that time had hoped to be a medical doctor. Sadly, my grades didn't allow me to reach that height, but I've spent my entire career being around medical people and certainly not being the smartest person in the room. But what I've really enjoyed has just been being around cutting edge science and cutting edge medicine over the last 30 years. And that could only have really come from that entire point of passion to your question. And everything thereafter stuck to that particular goal, if I'm honest.
I finished my degree in 2006. I studied biology and a little bit of physics. And at that time, you were doing either that, life science, or computer science, but there was nothing at the intersection of both. That being said, in my field, for instance, I had friends working in electron microscopy. And in electron microscopy, there was a fair bit of programming and using a lot of computer-based things, also in structural biology, but using X-ray. And we also had a few people that were focusing on the software side of things. So there was already a hint at that time, but there was not really courses at the university that would prepare you specifically for that. So I'm really curious whenever I have guests on the podcast to understand what brought them to what they are doing today, which obviously they couldn't study at that time.
Another great question. I identified a route at university that was as close as I could find to a role that would get me into the medical industry, in and around the medical industry. And that was a degree course called the Pharmaceutical Sciences at the University of Greenwich in London. And really what that was intending to do was to prepare students for a career. So it was a 4-year degree in which the third year was an industrial placement year where I could have the opportunity to work in a wet chemistry lab, do lots of hands-on lab-based work. And I realized I didn't want to spend the rest of my career doing that. So it really focused me in my final year in looking into clinical research and understanding what those different roles might look like. And my first applications were for roles like CRA, clinical research associate, medical sales reps, all those kind of things. Anything that would get me closer to medicine and closer to medications and the application of those medications that I'd learned all about. And through many applications that I made, I think maybe 200 or 300, possibly more, in that first 6 months or something before I secured my first role with a CRO, a contract research organization that was Quintiles. It was actually not Quintiles, but it was bought out by Quintiles. That was my first foray into data, and that was a role in data management, really ground up paper-based CRFs, basically. And the earliest technology that we had was optical character recognition and scanning. That was tech. That was tech in 1996. There was me thinking I was at the forefront of technology, scanning these pieces of patient information and putting them into a very rudimentary database. It built from that point forward. And what I learned and really exposed myself to was clinical trials, clinical data, but also the methodologies around good clinical practice. And I had that embedded in me from the very beginning. I think that is key and core to my driving activities, but also the way in which my brain works. I'm very objective and I like rules. I like guide rails. I like to know there is a route for that medicine to get to market. And I understood it because I'd learned all about it. Some of the earliest trials that I worked on, believe it or not, one of the first ones was Viagra. So I worked on one of the earliest Viagra studies, and I tell my kids this story and they laugh so much. But that was my claim to fame before many years later working on COVID vaccines. It's given me an enormous opportunity. I've traveled extensively and worked overseas and learned many things, but along the way acquired knowledge around technology, so wearables and patient apps and different clinical trial approaches in and around early phase all the way through to late phase, rare disease, and everything else, non-interventional, observational. So it hasn't been a straight path by any stretch. It's been very much go with what feels right, what's interesting, and following my passion around that medical line, if that makes sense.
I don't know, to be honest, if there is a straight line, given that a lot of the things that we do today didn't really exist. And it's interesting what you were saying about scanning papers, because it feels very old school. But that being said, I worked very recently on some project where when I was asking my colleagues to send me data, they were telling me, yeah, we can mail them by post. And I was like, what do you mean? Because it's printed. So this kind of experience might be still extremely relevant as large pharmaceutical companies are revisiting the archive. They want to digitalize all the legacy data, and they are sitting on a lot of old data that are actually printed. Which brings us to like the first big topic for today. It's this intersection of technology and drug development. So it's been happening for like over 10 years, of course, but I think like the acceleration really started 2-3 years ago with ChatGPT being launched and triggering this interest in every industry on how can I, like, focusing on the tool rather than the problem, and we can talk about that later. So there is AI, it can do lots of stuff. So let's find ways to using this AI everywhere. And I think the pharmaceutical industry hasn't been immune to that, for the better or worse. But let's talk about the role of AI in accelerating drug discovery and preclinical research. I'd love to get your view on that, the type of project you worked on.
I think before we even go there, I think we need to just remind ourselves that the pharmaceutical industry, like many others, is very conservative. And let's not forget that it took many years for the pharmaceutical industry to accept that paper could go into an electronic data capture tool. You remember those days, right? When we were doing the earliest days of phones and tablets and data collection on that was a big deal. Now, what we're seeing and this acceleration of data collection through tools in and around AI and ChatGPT is quite extraordinary, because the bar has been lowered as far as acceptance and reduction of that conservative approach, and the tools are being developed at such pace now that if pharma companies and medical technology companies are not embracing it, they're going to get so far left behind, it's not even funny. And I listen to many podcasts on the subject, and we only have to look at the evidence of the last year, 18 months. In every iteration, it gets faster and faster, and the large language models are crunching through more and more data and giving us more quality empirical output. The tools are remarkable. I mean, I've been teaching my parents how to use ChatGPT because they don't know what it was all about. And I literally sat down with my parents. My dad's 91, and I explained it and I showed it to him on a tablet, and he was absolutely gobsmacked. I said, give me a question and I'll provide you with the answer. And within 2 seconds, I had an answer to that question. And it was nothing short of remarkable for him in his lifetime, how technology has moved forward, never mind in mine. I'm 50 now, and I've seen enormous strides. In his lifetime, there weren't televisions, for goodness sake. Technology has really moved forward at great pace. And as I say, in the last year, 18 months, it's really become imperative to big pharma and biotechs and every service around it to adopt in a very safe manner these tools and technologies that are ultimately going to bring medicines to market sooner. That's ultimately what drives us, right? It's about getting medicines into humans that need them, where they're needed, when they're needed, at a most timely but safe manner. And so my experience most recently has been within some of those pharma companies developing their own in-house chat GPTs behind firewalls where they're not sharing anything outside of the companies, but are honing those tools through core teams and core groups to make sure that the decisions, or at least the output, is sensible. And no large language model is going to be sensible unless it's validated by a human being. However much data we think we can ingest, those machine learning tools can do an awful lot more, of course. But the real stage gate, and this is the thing that I've tried to educate myself around and others, is just that you will always require that human intervention. There are reasons why medical statisticians, epidemiologists, health outcome researchers, medical doctors have spent 20 or 30 years doing what they're doing. It's because experientially, that human overlay has to be present in any ultimate decisions that are being made. And I think really, if I had any caution to it, it's just that we all remember that we don't get swept along with this and just say the technology is great and everything's going to be great in the future because it's here, because it's landed. But let's not forget, you and I, all the years of hard graft at the coalface where we learned the detail of how we collected that information in the first instance. You know, taking bloods from human beings, taking blood pressures, taking ECGs, all these devices and all these tools to collect information that ultimately gave us a whole picture of a patient in a clinical trial.
You mentioned something very interesting, like the adoption of tools and the pace, and the fact that pharma company, they don't speed up their process. They might be left behind. And it's interesting because I worked with very senior leaders in the pharmaceutical industry, and I think you can definitely feel the cautious, being very conservative. Whenever we want to implement new solution, the first person that will be the gatekeeper is the security officer. And again, don't get me wrong, I think it's for all the right reasons. We are dealing with sensitive data. What we produce also is very sensitive. They are not only sensitive data because we are talking about patients, but also because there is a lot of money involved with the intellectual property of what is being developed. But then I think we haven't managed to find the right balance between caution, security, and being able to work faster. And when you see in the lower rank of the organization, so pharmaceutical companies are starting to hire technologists, data scientists. When I told to them, and in multiple organizations, you can sense this frustration where people want to try something, and it takes them months of approval sometimes to be able to get their hands on something, like on a GitHub repository, where they don't even know if they will end up using it in the end. They just want to try it. And what that leads to is people doing a lot of what's the word, like they use the personal computer to try things like shadow IT type of things, which is terrible. Do you have a perspective on that? On how do you balance this need for security, but also this evolution of our industry, which is really driven by what's happening today with AI and the need to speed things up? Also, if we want to attract the right talents.
Yeah, there's several layers to that question, of course. I have seen those big groups of data scientists being brought into organizations. And the first experience I had, I recently had of that, I got the distinct impression that those data scientists weren't necessarily particularly focused on clinical trial methodologies or have an understanding of where that data came from. They were just looking at data. It was just data. Could have been any data. And that might be harsh, but actually, I think, any company can bring in data scientists, but ultimately they need to understand what's going on behind that data. And to your question around the security and the evolution of the data, I think what's key really is that there needs to be documentation that secures the data, processes that are in place where the people handling that information are given the guide rails effectively, but also that data itself is effectively work in progress because it's not final, it's not validated, it's work in progress. It's dirty data, effectively, isn't it?
Mm.
Until it's come through what we would say, until it's really been validated, truly validated in its greatest sense. And that might be through SAS programming, through R or macro, however we want to do it. Effectively, what we're saying is we cannot possibly take data on face value alone. It has to be validated. There has to be process around those actions that tie the data to particular quality standards. And that's absolutely essential. And I haven't necessarily seen that bit yet because it hasn't happened yet. Because many of these companies are just literally churning through their data in-house. So let's say they've got 30, 40 years worth of data that they're churning through their own large language model, through their data science teams, and then validating it through interested parties in-house in a firewalled fashion. That bit hasn't happened yet. Do you see what I mean? So we're at this kind of cusp. I don't know what the timing of that might be, but I know these activities are running in parallel. So quality teams and senior security officers, let's say CSOs and those kind of level of people are looking at data privacy, are looking at the quality of the information that's coming through, and really whether or not that can be used in earnest to save time in the clinical trial process, or indeed how that might be. But that takes smart people. Do you know what I mean? It needs a lot of smart people in one particular place where they can agree on what that's going to look like. I haven't been privy to those conversations, but that's how I would anticipate from my experiences how that might play through.
I'm starting to hear more and more the need for people who are bilingual, that are life scientists and data scientists, with dual education, or at least enough learning on the job that you really understand enough of the life science to make sense of the data that you see. And another thing also, you mentioned data, like data being a very important asset in pharma, obviously. When we talked before recording, we talked about the opportunities for pharmaceutical company to monetize data assets and really the value of data assets. And obviously, not all data have the same value, because it's not because you have tons of data that they are all valuable. You said it, that a lot of data are dirty. I've seen data actually that were so dirty that you couldn't make sense of it because it was just tables full of data with no column header, no metadata, no description whatsoever, which means that you can't do anything with that. And when you start to go back several years, like the data, most of the time, they start to look like that, a bunch of numbers that you can't really make sense of. Is there anything you want to say about this, the value of data, the opportunity for company to monetize data assets in pharma?
It's clear that over the last few years, big tech, I'm talking about the likes of Google, Apple, Meta, have really identified that there is value in people's information and people's data, and they have been honing that. Now, I don't wear an Apple Watch. I don't wear a smart phone. Sorry, I don't wear a smart wearable. I never have done. And that's personal choice. As much as many of the things I don't do, I probably would be expected to do. But actually, I don't want people knowing exactly what I'm doing when I'm doing it. For example, when do you get up? How long are you sleeping? How many times a day are you walking? When does your heart rate go above a particular point? Because that's private to me. If I want to share that, I'll share it. But I certainly don't want to share it because I've paid £400 or £500 for a watch to a company that are then going to monetize that information on a global scale. So I think big tech have switched on to this a long time ago, and they've been collecting this data for now quite some time, haven't they? Let's be honest. So there is already value in that large data set, and there are other wearables and other technologies now that are coming online rapidly where people are agreeing to share their data. I think where the challenge, exactly to your point, comes is when this is either unregulated or unstructured data is like art, isn't it? One person thinks it looks good and another person thinks it's horrible. A Picasso to one person might be the greatest thing they've ever seen, and to another person might just be splodges of paint on a canvas. And data cannot be that. It has to be structured, to your point, and to all our GCP training that we've ever received throughout our career. How can you prove something unless there is structure behind that information and agreement and approval for the collection of that data? that feels like the Wild West. So if companies like Apple and Google and others are going to do that, then they again need to apply the same guide rails and rigor to the data collection and rigor to the data outcomes that we would do. Otherwise, really, it can't be substantiated. And I think that's really where this gray is at the moment. It's obviously data is important and data is valuable, but how you define that data itself, I think, is really core to that particular point, because you can't make decisions on dosing or uptake or quality of life measures unless it's within those kind of parameters and understood parameters. I don't see it that way anyway. As I say, I'm not a medical doctor, I'm not an epidemiologist, but I work with enough of them to know that they would not accept that. They would not sign off against that. What do you think?
When you get subject matter expert working with data scientists, it takes a lot of training to understand the data you're working with. I worked in the past on a product, and it was a chemistry database. So we extract chemical compounds and all sorts of parameters associated to a compounds. We had, in terms of type of parameters that could be associated to one compound, we had over 500. So I'm not a chemist, I'm a biochemist, which my real chemist friend will say it's not real chemistry. If I look at those 500 parameters, maybe I know 10% of them. So imagine someone who never studied that. They will look at those data and they will be like, I don't even know if this unit with this number makes sense. So I think it's very important to have people who can really understand the data, the meaning of the data. I had an interesting conversation also recently. Actually, that's the second episode that I already released, where Ben told about the value of the data, not the monetary value, but when you think about data points, for instance, in oncology, it comes from a patient that gave his blood or gave a tissue sample. Then we extracted data from it. And when you think about how this data is treated sometimes, it's not normal that you might lose this data or that you might lose the context of this data, because you need to think it comes from a person. So of course, when you aggregate that and you have millions of lines in an Excel file, then it's dehumanized. But then you always need to remember where it comes from and treat this data with respect. Often I've seen data not being treated with the respect they deserve, simply because people tend to forget what is the industry they're working on and where the data came from and what is the goal of using this data. Because it comes from a patient, it will be used to answer a scientific question, and then eventually it will be used to develop a drug to treat the patient. So I think that's super important to always have that in mind. But if we were to switch to another thing which is very important, so we talked about data, we talked about tools, but let's talk about the really digital transformation in life sciences, because all the companies now want to be tech-enabled, but they are not necessarily ready to be tech-enabled. I've seen a lot of organizations where there is a tech department, but the scientists, they don't really know where the tech department is, and they will treat tech people sometimes as, okay, my printer is not working, can you help me connect it? And I've seen a few organizations where you really have tech part of the scientific team, which I think that's how it should be. But how do you get there? So have you seen examples throughout your career of things done right, things not done right? And how do you create the right environment to ensure that pharma can leverage technology?
From my perspective, I think pharma should stick to what pharma are good at. That's running trials, doing good science, and developing medicines. I think they are trying to take on too much if they're building technological arms. I think there are many new companies out there that are offering those services to pharma, and that's their expertise, that's their wheelhouse. And to my mind, I think it makes sense to use experts to do expert roles rather than try and build functions. It reminds me of many years ago when pharma companies brought in their own in-house data management, stats, medical writing, and all those kind of things. And it's been cyclical, as you will know as well as I do. There are cycles in all pharma CRO world. And there was a period of time when they'd invest for 5 to 10 years in building their own in-house function, then realize it was completely nonsensical. It was a lost leader, and they were accused of cooking the books and coming up with their own data on their own studies. So there was an independence that was determined around using CROs. And I think there is a similar analogous situation with technologies. Personally, I think they should work alongside other technology experts and companies that really do focus on doing the nuts and bolts of building technology that can bring that to bear. That seems to me to be the most sensible way to do it, because that way you're going to have an alignment around the capabilities and skills that exist already within pharma, alongside the technologists that you can bring in and partner with and teach and advise and really find some kind of overlap there whereby the tools match the requirements. Otherwise, you're trying to reinvent the wheel, aren't you? That's what it feels like. It feels like a big effort and a heavy lift for pharma to think that they can be technologists. Sorry.
I think the argument you're making is this make versus buy or versus partner. And it can be an entire discussion on that, where like there are things that might make sense to build, whereas there are a lot. I agree with you. Like a lot of solutions, standard solution exist, and sometimes it's better to get a standard solution. I've been a product manager for more than a decade, and the thing that I hate the most is like the super customized solution that is absolutely impossible to maintain. But that's almost an entire discussion. But if we focus on the implementation of those tools, so regardless whether they're made in-house or both, I think there is also creating the environment to be able to use technology in pharma, regardless how you bring this technology. But and you mentioned using AI tools like ChatGPT applied to drug R&D, and I think you have some experience in that. So can you tell us what you are at liberty to say around developing that and implementing this kind of tool in the pharmaceutical environment?
I will preface it by saying I do absolutely have to be careful what I share, but what I have seen particularly is around that development, the in-house development, but there be a plan to it, and that it is very much highly regulated, but within very fixed guardrails. So these things are happening, and I doubt we will ever hear big pharma telling the outside world really what they're doing. They're not going to tell people what they're doing, because that's their own IP. That's also effectively what's going to differentiate them from the competition and maybe perhaps gets their medicines to market sooner. But in reality, what I've seen and what I've experienced is very recently training, rollout of these tools and the use of these tools alongside existing day-to-day activities. So this is how we normally do it, and this is our future self. Compare, contrast, track, validate, show us what you're doing. I don't think the speed of adoption is what it needs to be. That's my personal experience. But that might just be inertia of big pharma. And I think with big pharma particularly, where you might be challenged is that there are different therapeutic areas and there are different focuses for the business. They're trying to provide value to the shareholders whilst focusing on their particular therapeutic areas. And I think, these tools are going to sit right across all of those therapies and will give value to each one of those particular functions. So it's not as straightforward as that, but I don't have a timeline for that, when those kind of things will be rolled out. But if I were sitting on the board of a pharma company right now, I'd be saying we need this now. The real world is dealing with this and is adapting to this and adopting it right now. How far behind the curve are we, and how long can we wait? I don't think it's more than the end of 2025, to be quite frank. I think all the big pharma need to have that.
Talking about future proofing, so you were mentioning that the UK government just announced their support for AI for future proofing the UK economy. So that was announced a couple of days ago by the science minister. In France also, we hear that a lot. I think in all the European countries, you hear that. But what you see more, and I know there is a lot of sarcasm around that EU is great at creating guidelines and rules, but not necessarily at innovating. But now we hear prominent ministers talking about how do they want to future-proof their economy, have AI everywhere. What do you think will be the impact? So do you think that will really drive something forward?
Honestly, I think it's a fascinating aspect because I was at lunch a couple of days ago with a friend of mine. He's got a tech company close to me, and we've worked together in developing medical apps in the past. And we went to lunch and we were talking on the day that announcement was made. And his plan was to read through that entire document and find the pertinent parts around getting investment, because his take on it as a technologist and as a tech company that does support health apps and health implementations was, what could he get from that as a small business owner, right? So he's got, let's say, 20-25 staff and works across all industries, but has a particular interest in healthcare. And so that evening I went back and I had a look at it, and there is a lot of noise. There is a lot of very positive noise, but also what I then saw was that on LinkedIn over the next couple of days, and today included, there is an announcement that there is going to be this tech life science hub being set up in Farringdon in London, near St Pancras. And there's going to be enormous investment in that, and there are opportunities. Now, that can only be a positive because it's bringing in public investment to align with private enterprise. And generally, if there is a tangible value to that, then there will be adoption. And London is a central tech hub, as are many parts of the UK, as are many other parts of the EU. But I think for the current government to come out and make an announcement like that is probably quite timely. They've seen that there is an opportunity to win favour with voters and put some positive news out there for a change, rather than all the doom and gloom that we seem to be sharing around in the last year.
That's a great segue to the last part of this discussion. Last year has been terrible from an economic perspective and from employment perspective, specifically in pharma and biotech. I think it's been the worst years in terms of layoff. A lot of very talented people have been impacted, and I think that comes on the tail end of COVID, where during COVID there was maybe too much hiring, and then obviously an economic downturn. Hopefully 2025 will be better, but you have a lot of people on the job market now. And that's how we connected, because we were talking about what do you do when you spend the last 20, 30 years in the same company? And you find yourself back looking for a job when you haven't been looking for a job for 20, 30 years. And we met through LinkedIn, which obviously I would recommend anyone using this to prevent this from happening, or if this happens, as the number one tool for finding a solution. But what's your take on that, on the job market and on the personal branding and all those things required for experienced professionals that are experienced in their job but not experienced in looking for a new job?
Thankfully, I think I've had experience of being made redundant over the years, and I've been a consultant for many years now. So I know the levers to pull. I think I know the levers to pull when I need to find those new opportunities. But I have plenty of friends in this industry who have been exactly those people, who've been golden handcuffs stuck in that career for 20, 25 years in big pharma and biotech. And for those people, it's a very tough world to be thrown into right now. It's a bear pit, I would say. There are tools and there are mechanisms and there are ways in which we can showcase ourselves. But I think people are very smart and understand that it's very obvious when someone is trying to do that. If there is a consistency in your behavior online, for example, in LinkedIn, which I consider to be one of the best tools for business development that I could ever wish, if you see someone rapidly ratcheting up their sharing, their activity on LinkedIn, it's always with that purpose in mind. I think it's very clear, particularly if they've never had a track record of that. And I've got plenty of former colleagues who are currently looking for roles who maybe have still got the same photo on LinkedIn that they've had for 20 years. They don't look like that. And there have been people that I met and I'm like, oh my God, that's not you. That's not you. So you've got to keep it current. You've got to keep it alive. You've got to share interesting anecdotes, but also I think what people are looking for on LinkedIn particularly, and other similar platforms, are the real stories behind the people. What is it you're interested in as well? There's certain things that I do that I'm very proud about, that I don't necessarily shout about, but I work with my alumni at my University of Greenwich. I've been doing work with them for the last 5 years, and I showcase opportunities for students. I'm connected with their employability service. I regularly go back and I speak to the students at the university and try and open doors for new life scientists coming into the industry, because that's what also lights me up. I recognize the fact that Greenwich was that platform for me. It opened doors for me into an industry that I love, and that I want many other talented life scientists who are coming into the industry to be able to do that. But it's not an open door. It's a very difficult place to get into. And what I've been trying to do, certainly with my mentees and with the alumni, is try and push some of those doors open for the next generation, because it's a hard place to get into, never mind to stay in, be successful, and build a reputation around your services. It's a difficult employability platform at the moment, as you say. And the only reason I think I embrace opportunity for change as I do is because, honestly, when you've been made redundant, you don't get any lower than that. So if you have autonomy for yourself, the actions and the opportunities that come your way through word of mouth, through professional networks, and through these mediums, through putting yourself out there, going on podcasts and showing your face, giving your voice to things, I think that there's a much broader understanding of the person behind the service, the skill set on that CV. This is me. This is what you get. This is what you will be dealing with. My personal and professional are very closely aligned. And I think, back to your original point around 2024 versus 2025, from a personal point of view, it was a very challenging year for me as well. So I want to draw a line under the end of last year and move forward as well, and move forward with positivity, with kindness, and with good energy, and share time with people who share that energy and positivity.
Final thing, so since we are talking about 2025, how do you see the future of work in life science? So I've seen personally obviously a lot of changes, lots of people in the job market, a lot of companies that had remote work or hybrid work now are going back to full on-site. And obviously having people on site is great for cohesion. It helps a lot for getting projects moving forward. It's not great when you want to attract talent, because it means that you are restricted to a certain area. And when in the past, or in a previous role, I worked remote for most of the past 10 years. I had very talented colleagues that were sitting like many time zones away. If we had an only on-site policy, I would have never met with or worked with those people. So what's your view on how things are evolving in the current job market, and what is it going to be like? I know it's a bit of a crystal ball exercise, but what's your take on that?
Having, similar to you, been working remotely probably for the last more than 10 years, 10, 12 years, something like that. In the last 3 or 4 years, I've built this garden room where I am today. That would never have happened had it not been for COVID. But this is where I do my best work. And as far as I'm concerned, I can do my best work anywhere in the world with the technology that exists today. And I have been holding down very successfully jobs for the last 4 or 5 years doing exactly this, and only having gone to a physical office a handful of times, literally a handful of times. There are clients I've worked with for the last few years I've never actually physically met. We just have arrangements and agreements and professional confidence in one another's abilities. So I am aware that the workplace, companies are trying to get people back into the workplace, but actually speaking to those people that have to commute, what's in it for them? Why are they wasting 2 or 3 hours a day on a train, in a car, wherever they're commuting, to then do a working day and be rinsed at the end of it and repeat that five times a week? That doesn't make sense. That doesn't bring out the best in people, and it certainly doesn't build longevity in roles and commitment from those people. If you treat people like grown-ups, they'll behave like grown-ups. If you treat people like children, guess what? Don't be surprised if they try and push those boundaries. And there was one company I worked for many years ago who I really admired in the fact that they just said, we want the best people. We don't care where they are. Doesn't matter if you're 50 miles from our nearest office. As long as you're at home and as long as you've got the technology, you've got a fiber broadband, we don't care. As long as you show up, you do your best work, we trust you, we will treat you like adults. And when you need to travel, we'll ask you to travel and we'll pay for you to travel. And it won't be in your time, it will be in our time. Those are the kind of companies that will succeed in this new generation, not the people or companies that need people to check in physically. Where are we? It's 2025. It's not 1950. It just isn't.
Well, I do agree with you violently, I will say. Any final words?
Yeah, I really appreciate, Thibaut, what you're doing. I said this before we came on air, but I think what you're doing is you're opening the door to conversations, interesting conversations between people on a platform and using exactly the tools at your disposal. And I think that is extremely powerful. And this is the way forward. You know, in the modern world, in the modern virtual world, this is how good work will be done by subject matter experts in the future and continuing to do so. And building up those networks of like-minded, like-capable people is absolutely pivotal to consultancy, to doing the work that we're doing, to bringing that expertise to bear into this industry. And I think the sooner that big pharma, biotech, CROs understand that, the louder our voices will become and the more this platform will land for you. You know, as I say, I can't thank you enough for giving me the opportunity today, because this is where I do my best work, in the virtual world. Thank you.
Adam, thanks a lot for joining. And again, our prep discussion was very enjoyable. This one was also extremely enjoyable. So I'm sure we'll stay connected online, and I'm sure we'll have many more of those conversations. And who knows, we might even meet in person when I'm over in the UK. So
I'd love that.
thanks again, and I'll close the episode now.